You don't even know who the father is." The millionaire CEO smirked. 2 years later, he saw her with twin boys and knew the truth. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty clothe every woman in strength softer than silk, but stronger than storms. May her heart never break without finding wings, and her faith never fade even when the world turns cold. May every sleepless night become a dawn of divine favor, and every scar become a crown of survival. You are the grace that holds the home together, the song after sorrow, and the light that never surrenders. My beloved family, your voice matters. Your love keeps this mission alive. A like is a seed of hope. A comment is a flame of courage. This is Mission 1000 likes for every woman who still stands tall after heartbreak, still forgives, still believes. If your heart beats in faith, like this video. If your soul still chooses love, comment, "I'm with Mr. Peter." You don't even know who the father is, do you? The words sliced through the air between them. And Grace Kelly felt something inside her chest die, not her love for Gary Cooper, but her belief that love could ever bridge the chasm between a black woman who had clawed her way out of Detroit's East Side and a white billionaire who had never questioned whether the world was built for him. She stood in his office on the 47th floor, surrounded by glass walls that reflected nothing but sky, and watched the man she loved transform into someone she should have recognized from the beginning. The pregnancy test results trembled in her hand. 3 separate confirmations from 3 separate doctors, because she had needed to be certain before coming here, before opening herself to this vulnerability, before believing that the past 3 months had meant something real. Gary paced behind his mahogany desk, his movements sharp with agitation, and every step he took felt like distance multiplying between them. His jaw was clenched in that particular way that meant he was calculating, assessing risk, running probability scenarios, and Grace understood with sudden clarity that she had become a problem requiring solution rather than a woman carrying his child. "I know exactly who the father is," she said, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening beneath her ribs. "The same man who quoted James Baldwin to me over dinner. The same man who told me that love was the only thing that mattered. The same man who is apparently someone entirely different when consequences arrive." Gary stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hardening into something she had seen him use in meetings. That particular blend of skepticism and superiority that reduced people to inconveniences. "Grace, be reasonable. We've known each other for 3 months. One night of—" He paused, searching for clinical language. "One night of intimacy doesn't mean one night." The laugh that escaped her throat tasted like broken glass. "Is that what you're calling it now? Intimacy? I remember you calling it something else when you were inside me. I remember you saying you loved me. I remember you asking me to trust you." His face flushed, but whether from shame or anger she could not tell. "I'm not saying I don't have feelings for you. I'm saying that this is convenient timing. We attended that charity gala together. There were other men there. You danced with—" "Don't!" The word came out like a whip crack, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't you dare finish that thought. Don't you dare suggest that I slept with other men at a gala, where I spent the entire evening watching you work the room, where I stood in corners feeling like an imposter in a borrowed dress, where the only reason anyone spoke to me was because I was standing next to you." Grace moved closer to his desk, her hands instinctively protective over her stomach, even though nothing showed yet, even though the only evidence of new life was chemical markers in her blood, and the absence of her monthly cycle, and the bone-deep knowledge that everything had changed. She had come here with hope blooming in her chest like spring after a long winter, had imagined scenarios where Gary would pull her close and kiss her forehead and tell her they would figure this out together. Instead, she was watching him choose fear. "You told me I was your first," Gary said, his voice dropping lower, almost accusing. "Any woman who would sleep with a man on the first night—" "Stop!" Grace held up her hand, and something in her expression made him fall silent. I'm going to give you one chance to hear yourself. One chance to understand what you're actually saying. You're standing in your palace in the sky, looking at a woman who loved you enough to trust you with her body. And you're calling her a liar and a whore because the alternative is that you might have to be brave. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread below them like a kingdom Gary controlled, and Grace understood that she had been foolish to think she belonged in his world. She had grown up watching her mother Rowena clean houses for families like the Coopers, had learned early that white men's promises evaporated when confronted with consequences, had told herself Gary was different because he donated to racial justice causes and used the right language and made love to her like she was precious. But now, she saw the truth beneath the performance. His progressive politics were costume jewelry that shattered under pressure. Gary opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a checkbook, and the gesture was so casually cruel that Grace actually stepped backward. He wrote quickly, tore the check free, and held it out to her. $50,000. That should be more than enough to handle this situation. I'll have my assistant recommend a discreet clinic. Grace looked at the check floating in the space between them and felt something. Fundamental shift in her understanding of human capacity for disappointment. She had thought Julian leaving her at the altar was the worst betrayal she would ever experience. She had been wrong. Handle this situation, she repeated softly. Is that what you call your child? A situation? Grace, please. His voice carried an edge of desperation now, but it was the wrong kind, not desperation to fix what he had broken, but desperation for her to make this convenient. You have to understand, my father warned me about this exact scenario. He showed me the lawsuits, the letters from women claiming paternity, the settlements he paid to make false accusations disappear. He had photographs of women he'd never touched claiming they carried Cooper children, DNA tests that proved lies, legal documents showing how people tried to destroy him with pregnancy claims for money. Gary moved around his desk, getting closer to Grace, but maintaining distance as though she might contaminate him. There was this one woman when I was in college. She said she was pregnant with my child. I believed her. I was going to marry her, Grace. I was ready to do the right thing. And then my father had her investigated and discovered she wasn't even pregnant. She had faked the test results. She wanted access to the Cooper money. When we confronted her, she admitted everything. She tried to trap me with a lie. His voice cracked with remembered humiliation and rage. My father made me watch the video of her confession, made me understand that people see the Cooper name and they see dollar signs, that women especially will use pregnancy as a weapon because the law favors mothers. He showed me 12 other cases, women who had tried the same thing with him, with my grandfather, with other wealthy men. He made me promise I would never be caught in that trap again, never trust a pregnancy claim without proof, never let emotion override logic. Grace felt ice spreading through her veins as she understood the depth of Winslow's poison. So your father traumatized you with one liar, and now every woman who tells you she's pregnant is automatically lying. Not every woman, Gary protested weakly. But Grace, we barely know each other. 3 months. And you have to admit the timing is suspicious. Right after I mentioned restructuring my will, right after that conversation about my family's wealth. I never asked you about your money, Grace interrupted, her voice shaking now with fury. I never asked you for anything except honesty and respect. But you've decided that because one woman lied to you in college, because your father filled your head with paranoia, that I must be lying too. Tell me, Gary, is it all women you don't trust or just black women specifically? The question hung between them like an accusation he could not quite deny. Gary's face went pale. That's not fair. This has nothing to do with... It has everything to do with race, Grace cut him off. Your father showed you women trying to trap Cooper men, and I guarantee every single one of them was white. Because that's the story white men tell themselves. That white women are gold diggers, but at least they're familiar predators. But a black woman? We're not just after your money. We're trying to infiltrate your bloodline. We're the ultimate threat. And you absorbed that lesson so completely that when I came to you pregnant, you saw an enemy instead of the woman you claimed to love. Gary opened his mouth to protest, but no words came because Grace had named the truth he had not wanted to examine. The paranoia his father had instilled was not race-neutral. It was built on generations of white families protecting their wealth and their bloodlines from contamination. And black women had always been cast as the most dangerous contaminators of all. I need proof, Gary said finally, his voice hollow. I need a paternity test. Once the child is born, Once the child is born, Grace repeated slowly. You want me to carry this pregnancy alone, endure 9 months of your doubt and suspicion, give birth, and then prove to you that your paranoia was unfounded. You want me to earn your trust by submitting to testing as though I'm on trial? It's the only way to be certain, Gary insisted, and Grace saw him retreating further into his father's logic, saw him choosing Winslow's fear over his own judgment. If you're telling the truth, you have nothing to worry about. The test will prove it, and then we can move forward. Grace stared at him and felt the last connection between them sever. If I'm telling the truth, that's your position. After 3 months of saying you loved me, after all the conversations we had about trust and partnership and building something real together, when it matters, you choose to believe your father's paranoia over my honesty. She moved toward the door, leaving the check on the floor where it had fallen, and Gary called after her, panic finally penetrating his wall of defensive logic. Wait, Grace, wait. I'm not saying I don't care about you. I'm saying I need to be smart here. I need to think with my head instead of my heart. If you would just be reasonable. Grace turned back one final time, and Gary flinched at the expression on her face. Reasonable? You think throwing money at me is reasonable? You think accusations and doubt and requiring proof of my honesty is reasonable? You think asking me to gestate your child under suspicion for 9 months is reasonable? Let me tell you what reasonable actually looks like, Gary. Reasonable is believing someone you love when they tell you the truth. Reasonable is examining your own prejudices instead of projecting them onto others. Reasonable is choosing to be brave instead of choosing to be your father's son. She stepped into the hallway, and Gary followed, his composure completely shattered now. If you walk away, if you refuse to take the money or agree to testing, that just proves I'm right to be cautious. It proves you're hiding something. The accusation was so absurd, so perfectly demonstrative of the trap he had constructed, that Grace actually laughed. Of course. If I accept your money, I'm a gold digger who was lying all along. If I refuse your money, I'm suspicious and hiding something. There's no scenario in which I'm simply an honest woman who loved you. You've built a cage that proves your father's worldview no matter what I do. She pressed the elevator button, and Gary stood frozen in his doorway, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to catalogue. What are you going to do? He asked finally, and Grace heard fear beneath the question, not fear for her or the child, but fear of what her decision might mean for him. I'm going to raise this baby alone, Grace said as the elevator doors opened. I'm going to give them every ounce of love I have, and I'm going to make sure they understand that they are wanted and valued, even though their father was too afraid to want them. That's what I'm going to do. Grace. No. She stepped into the elevator, and the word had finality that silenced him. You made your choice when you listened to your father's stories, instead of trusting your own heart. You made your choice when you saw my black face and decided I must be lying. You made your choice when you pulled out that checkbook, and now you get to live with those choices for the rest of your life. The elevator doors began to close, and Grace looked at Gary one last time. I hope your father's approval feels like love. I hope your certainty keeps you warm at night. I hope you never have to wonder what you lost when you chose fear. The doors sealed shut, and Grace descended through the building's steel heart, her spine straight despite the tears threatening to fall. She had walked into that building carrying hope, and walked out carrying only herself and the child growing inside her. But that would be enough. It would have to be enough. She stepped onto the street into afternoon sunshine, and she placed both hands over her flat stomach. "Just us now," she whispered. "But I promise you'll never doubt you were wanted. I promise you'll never feel like a problem someone tried to solve with money." Grace walked toward the subway, toward her modest apartment, toward a future that terrified and thrilled her. She did not look back at the tower where Gary stood, probably already calling his lawyers, probably already protecting himself from the consequences of his choices. She simply moved forward, because that was what women like her had always done. 26 months later, Grace pushed a double stroller through the museum's sculpture garden, explaining the difference between marble and bronze to William, who collected facts like treasures. Clark was babbling about butterflies, and autumn's sun was warm on her shoulders, and Grace felt something like peace. Then she felt it, that specific quality of attention that prickled her skin. She turned and saw Gary Cooper frozen on the pathway 15 feet away, staring at the stroller with an expression of such complete devastation that for one vicious moment, Grace felt vindicated. Then she looked down at her sons, at their identical faces that were unmistakably their father's, at the amber-green eyes they had inherited, and she felt the first crack in the armor she had built around her heart. Gary took one stumbling step forward, and Grace watched his face cycle through shock and recognition as he calculated backward to a night when he had made the worst mistake of his life. Their eyes met, and Grace understood that everything was about to change again. Chapter 2. The Garden of Ghosts. Gary Cooper could not breathe properly, could not form words, could not do anything except stare at the two identical faces peering up at him from the stroller, faces that were mirror images of his own childhood photographs, complete with the unusual amber-green eyes that his mother Temperance called the Cooper curse, because they marked every generation with unmistakable proof of bloodline. The boys were beautiful in ways that physically hurt him to witness, dressed in hand-knit sweaters that spoke of loving hands and careful attention, their skin a perfect blend of his paleness and Grace's deep brown that created something entirely new and miraculous. William was watching him with solemn curiosity, while Clark was grinning and waving his small hand, and Gary felt his knees weaken as the magnitude of what he was seeing crashed through his carefully constructed reality. He had missed everything. First smiles, first words, first steps. Every milestone that marked a life had happened without him, and the loss felt like someone had reached into his chest and extracted something vital. Grace. Her name came out broken, barely audible, and she flinched as though he had shouted, "Grace, please. Are they—" "Don't." She moved between him and the stroller with the swift violence of maternal instinct, her body language screaming protection and warning. "Don't you dare ask me that question. Don't you dare act surprised. Don't you dare pretend you have any right to know anything about them." Gary took another step forward, unable to stop himself, drawn by a gravitational pull stronger than anything he had experienced. William had stopped smiling, picking up on adult tension with the particular sensitivity of children who had learned to monitor their mother's moods for safety. Clark was reaching toward Gary with small hands, drawn by curiosity or recognition that operated below conscious awareness. "How old are they?" Gary's voice came out strangled. Grace's laugh was sharp enough to draw blood. "You mean you can't calculate it yourself? Strange, since mathematics was your specialty when you were determining whether I was lying about the pregnancy, when you were constructing timelines to figure out if I could have slept with other men at that gala." The words hit him like physical blows, each one deserved, each one landing exactly where she intended. Gary's hands were shaking, had been shaking since the moment he saw the boys, and he clasped them together to hide the tremor. "I was wrong. About everything. I should have believed you. I should have trusted you instead of my father's paranoia. I should have been brave enough to love you instead of scared enough to hurt you." "Yes," Grace agreed coldly. You should have done all those things, but you didn't. You listened to Winslow's stories about women lying for money and decided I was one of them. So you made your choice. These are the consequences. William had started to whimper, sensing his mother's distress, and Clark's smile had vanished, replaced by uncertainty that broke Gary's heart. Grace immediately knelt beside the stroller, her voice transforming into something soft and reassuring as she spoke to her sons. "It's okay, babies. Mama's fine. We're going to go see the fountain now, remember? You wanted to throw pennies and make wishes." She stood and began pushing the stroller away without another glance at Gary, and panic seized his throat with such force that he heard himself say her name again, louder this time, desperately. "Grace, please. Please don't walk away. Let you what?" She whirled around, her eyes blazing with fury that had been building for over 2 years. "Let you explain? Let you apologize? Let you meet the sons you didn't believe existed? Tell me, Gary, what exactly do you think you're entitled to here?" "Nothing." The word came out raw and honest. "I'm entitled to nothing. I know that. But Grace, they have a right. They have a right to a father who wanted them from the beginning." Grace cut him off, her voice shaking now with barely controlled emotion. "They have a right to a father who believed their mother when she told him the truth. They have a right to better than what you were capable of giving." Gary felt something breaking apart inside him, the carefully constructed walls he had built around his emotions crumbling into dust. "You're right about all of it. But Grace, I've been in therapy every day since you left. I've been working with a psychologist who specializes in inherited trauma. I've been trying to understand how my father's damage became my damage, how his paranoia infected me so completely that I couldn't trust the woman I loved. So you want credit for going to therapy?" Grace's voice was dangerously quiet. "You want me to be impressed that you're working through issues you should never have had in the first place? Gary, I don't care about your therapy. I care about my sons growing up knowing they're wanted and valued, and you can't give them that." "I want to try," Gary said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I want to try to be their father. I want to try to prove that I'm different now than I was then. I know I don't deserve a chance, but Grace, please, they deserve to know. They deserve a father who was there," Grace interrupted. "They deserve a father who showed up for the hard parts, not just the convenient parts. You missed their first year entirely. You missed Clark getting pneumonia when he was 8 months old and spending a week in the hospital. You missed William learning to walk. You missed every diaper and every sleepless night and every moment when I had to be both parents because you were too afraid to be one." The litany of missed moments landed like blows, each one a testament to time irretrievably lost. Gary's face crumpled as he tried to process the magnitude of what he had forfeited. "I can't change the past. I can only try to do better going forward." "Better for who?" Grace demanded. "Better for them or better for you? Because it feels like you're trying to ease your own guilt rather than actually considering what they need." "Both," Gary admitted, because lying seemed impossible in the face of Grace's laser focus on truth. "I'm trying to ease my guilt by becoming someone they could be proud of. I'm trying to do better for them because they deserve a father. And I'm trying to do better for me because I can't live with who I was when I hurt you." Grace studied him for a long moment, and Gary saw the war happening behind her eyes, rage battling against something he could not quite identify. "Their names are William and Clark," she said finally, and the fact that she was telling him their names felt like the smallest crack in an impenetrable wall. "William is careful and thoughtful. He asks questions about everything. He needs time to warm up to new situations. Clark is fearless and funny. He loves music and dancing and hugs everyone. They're both brilliant and beautiful, and they've never once asked about you because they don't know to miss what they never had." The description of his sons was a gift and a weapon simultaneously, giving Gary information while reminding him how completely he was a stranger to them. "Thank you for telling me. For giving me even that much." "I'm not giving you anything," Grace corrected sharply. "I'm stating facts. These boys exist. They have personalities and preferences and lives that have nothing to do with you. And I need to decide whether introducing you into those lives would help or harm them. Let me meet them, Gary said, and he heard himself begging without shame. Supervised, in public, whatever conditions you want. Just let me try to be part of their lives. Grace looked down at William and Clark, then back at Gary, and he saw calculation happening in her expression. Why should I? Give me one reason why exposing them to you is better than keeping them safe from potential disappointment. Gary opened his mouth to give her rehearsed answers about fathers being important, about boys needing male role models, but Grace's expression told him that bullshit would not work. So he told her the truth. Because I've spent every day since seeing you walk out of my office understanding what I destroyed. Because I've watched other fathers with their children and felt grief so intense I could barely breathe. Because when I close my eyes, I see your face telling me I was too afraid to want our children, and I know you were right. And because if I don't at least try to be their father, I'll die knowing I made the same choice my own father made, choosing fear and protection over love and risk. I can't be Winslow, Grace. I have to try to be different. Trying isn't enough, Grace said, but her voice had lost some of its sharp edge. Trying is what you should have done 2 years ago. Now you need to do more than try. You need to prove through consistent action over time that you're safe for them, that you won't disappoint them, that you won't make them feel the way you made me feel. I'll do whatever it takes, Gary promised. Whatever timeline, whatever conditions, whatever proof you need, I'll do it. Grace was quiet for a long time, and Gary watched her internal debate play out across her face. Finally, she pulled out her phone. I'm calling your mother. If Temperance confirms that you're genuinely working on yourself and not just performing transformation to manipulate me, then I'll consider supervised visits. But Gary, if your mother tells me this is an act, if she expresses any doubt about your sincerity, then you never see these boys. Understood? Understood, Gary said, his heart pounding. His relationship with his mother had been complicated since he had started questioning his father's teachings, but Temperance had been supportive of his therapy and his attempts at growth. He could only hope that support translated into vouching for him. Grace made the call, stepping away so Gary could not hear the conversation. And he stood in the garden watching his sons in their stroller, memorizing their faces, hoping this was not the last time he would see them. When Grace returned, her expression was unreadable. Your mother is coming here, now. She wants to see her grandsons and evaluate whether you're ready to be in their lives. If she approves, we'll discuss next steps. If she doesn't, then you leave and you don't contact me again. Thank you, Gary breathed. Thank you for even considering. Don't thank me yet, Grace interrupted. You haven't passed the test. Temperance arrived within the hour, finding her son standing awkwardly near a bench, while Grace supervised the twins playing in a nearby fountain. When Temperance saw William and Clark for the first time, her face crumpled with emotion, and she moved toward them with the particular hunger of a grandmother who had been denied her grandchildren. Grace, Temperance said, approaching carefully, may I speak with them? Grace studied the older woman, then nodded once. William Clark, this is Temperance. She's your daddy's mama. That would make her your grandma, if we decide she can be part of your lives. William regarded Temperance with his characteristic seriousness. We already have a grandma. Grandma Rowena. You can have more than one grandma, Temperance said gently, kneeling to their level. And I would very much like to be part of your lives, if your mama allows it. Tell me, what do you boys like to do? Clark launched into an enthusiastic description of his favorite activities, while William watched carefully. And Grace observed Temperance with them, natural and warm, but not overly familiar, respecting boundaries while expressing genuine interest. When the boys returned to playing, Temperance turned to her son with an expression Gary could not quite decipher. Walk with me, she said to Gary, and they moved to a quieter section of the garden while Grace stayed with the twins. Mama, stop. Temperance held up her hand. I'm going to talk, and you're going to listen. I've watched you these past months working on yourself. I've watched you confront the poison your father fed you. I've watched you grieve what you lost. But Gary, I need to know, are you doing this work because you genuinely want to be different, or because you want something from Grace? Gary felt the weight of his mother's question. Both. I want to be different because who I was is unforgivable. And I want another chance with Grace and my sons, because I destroyed the first chance. But Mama, even if Grace never forgives me, even if I never get to be part of their lives, I have to keep doing this work. I have to break the pattern you and Dad created. I can't pass that damage to another generation. Temperance studied her son's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then I'll tell Grace you're sincere. But Gary, sincerity isn't enough. You need consistency. You need to show up even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient, even when it doesn't feel good. That's what being a parent actually means. Can you do that? I have to, Gary said simply, because the alternative is being my father, and I'd rather die. Temperance returned to Grace and spoke quietly while Gary watched from a distance, unable to hear but able to see Grace's body language soften slightly. When his mother finished, Grace looked at Gary for a long moment before calling him over. 1 hour, next Saturday, supervised, in public. And Gary, if you disappoint them, if you make them feel unwanted or uncertain or less than precious, this ends permanently. Gary felt tears burning his eyes. I understand. Thank you. Grace, thank you for— Don't, she cut him off. Thank me by doing better than you did before. Thank me by proving you've changed. Thank me by being the father they deserve. She gathered William and Clark and prepared to leave, and Gary watched his family walk away, understanding that he had been given a gift he absolutely could not waste. That night, Gary sat in his penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too empty, and he began writing a letter, not to Grace, but to Rowena, because he understood that earning Grace's trust meant earning the trust of the woman who had raised her, the woman who understood intimately what it meant to be abandoned by a man who chose fear over love. He wrote about his failures and his learning, and he asked Rowena for guidance on how to be better. He did not know if it would matter, but it felt like the right place to start. Grace arrived home that evening and held her sons extra close, reading them 3 stories instead of 1, and when they finally slept, she stood in their doorway and cried for the first time since leaving Gary's office all those months ago. She cried for the girl who had believed in love. She cried for her sons, who would grow up with a complicated legacy. And she cried because seeing Gary's face had stirred something dangerous in her chest, and she hated herself for it. Chapter 3. The Architecture of Atonement. The letters began arriving at Rowena's house in Detroit, not at Grace's apartment in the city, but at her mother's address that Gary had somehow discovered through means that probably involved money and investigators. The first letter was addressed to Rowena directly, and when she called Grace to read it aloud, Grace heard her mother's voice catch with unexpected emotion. He's apologizing to me, Rowena said, wonder in her tone. He's not asking me to intercede with you or convince you of anything. He's apologizing for hurting my daughter and asking me to teach him how men should treat women they love. He's asking me to explain what it's like to raise a child alone when the father chose easier paths. Grace, baby, this man is doing work. Grace felt resistance rising in her throat. Words are cheap, Mama. Julian said beautiful things too before he left me at that altar. Gary said he loved me before he accused me of lying about being pregnant. I don't trust words anymore. Then watch his actions, Rowena replied gently. He's written to me every 3 days for 2 weeks now. He's not asking for anything except wisdom. He's sending donations to organizations that support single mothers, not in his name, but anonymously through foundations. He's volunteering at shelters for abandoned families. He's putting his money and time where his guilt lives. So what? Grace paced her apartment, agitation making her movements sharp. He should have done all of that before he destroyed me. He should have questioned his father's paranoia before weaponizing it against me. He should have been decent from the beginning. You're absolutely right, Rowena agreed, surprising Grace into stillness. He should have, but he didn't, and now you get to decide whether people can change or whether one mistake defines them forever. That's the power you hold, and it's a hard power to wield. Grace hung up feeling more confused than before, and when Delphine arrived for her usual visit with the twins, she found Grace staring at an email from her mother containing Gary's latest letter. "Read it to me," Grace said, handing her phone to Delphine. "Tell me if you think he's sincere or performing." Delphine read aloud slowly, and Gary's words were careful and unvarnished, acknowledging that he had no right to Grace's forgiveness, describing the ways he was trying to dismantle his own racism and classism, explaining how therapy was helping him understand that his father's trauma had become his trauma, asking Rowena to help him learn how to love without possessiveness, how to support without controlling, how to be present without demanding center stage. When Delphine finished reading, she looked at Grace with troubled eyes. "He's not asking for anything. He's just doing work." "So what?" Grace heard herself repeating her earlier refrain. "Why should I care about his personal growth journey? He destroyed me, Delphine. He looked at me pregnant and terrified, and he called me a liar. He threw money at me like I was a problem to solve. Why should I give him credit for becoming a decent human being years too late?" Delphine set down the phone carefully. "Because you have two sons who might want to know their father if he's genuinely changed. Because keeping them from him isn't about protecting them anymore. It's about punishing him. And Grace, I love you, but using William and Clark as weapons against their father isn't fair to them." The accusation detonated in Grace's chest like a grenade. "How dare you suggest I'm using my sons as weapons? How dare you imply I'm the one being unreasonable here?" "I'm not implying anything," Delphine said, her voice remaining steady despite Grace's rising anger. "I'm saying directly that you need to examine your motivations. Are you protecting William and Clark from potential hurt, or are you protecting yourself from having to risk trusting Gary again? Because those are different things. You didn't hear what he said to me?" Grace's voice shook with remembered pain. "You didn't see his face when he accused me of sleeping with other men. You didn't feel what it was like to love someone completely and have them treat you like garbage the moment you needed them most." "You're right, I didn't," Delphine acknowledged. "But I have watched you build your entire life around those twins. I've seen you become the most devoted mother I know. And now I'm watching you teach them that their father is irredeemable, that people can't change, that one mistake erases all possibility of redemption. Is that really what you want them to learn?" Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes, angry that Delphine was pushing into places that hurt too much to examine. "Why are you defending him? You're supposed to be on my side." "I am on your side," Delphine replied firmly. "Which is why I'm telling you that holding on to this much anger is hurting you more than it's hurting him. I'm telling you that William and Clark deserve the chance to know their father if he's genuinely changed. I'm telling you that you deserve to stop carrying this rage around like armor that's become too heavy to wear." The argument escalated from there, voices rising despite the twins napping in the next room, and Grace heard herself attacking Delphine's right to have opinions about parenting, since she did not have children of her own. She watched her best friend's face crumple with hurt before Delphine grabbed her coat and left without another word. And Grace stood alone in her apartment, feeling the silence press in from all sides. She looked at the letter still open on her phone screen, Gary's handwriting neat and careful, his words asking nothing except wisdom, and she picked it up with trembling hands. She read it slowly this time, really read it instead of deflecting with anger. He wrote about attending workshops on unconscious bias and reading books by black women about their experiences navigating predominantly white spaces. He wrote about how his wealth had insulated him from understanding how most people lived, and how volunteering at shelters was teaching him about the daily indignities Grace must have faced. He wrote about his fear of becoming his father and his commitment to breaking patterns that had poisoned his family for generations. Grace read the letter 3 times, and by the 3rd reading, tears were streaming down her face. She hated that his words landed in her chest. She hated that they felt sincere. She hated that part of her wanted to believe that people could transform. That night, after putting William and Clark to bed, Grace drove to Detroit to her mother's house, needing the wisdom that only Rowena could provide. They sat at the kitchen table where Grace had learned resilience and strength, and Rowena made tea the way she always had, strong and sweet, comfort in a cup. "Tell me about my father," Grace said finally, asking the question she had avoided her whole life. "Tell me the real story, not the version you protected me with when I was small." Rowena was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes distant with memory. "Tobias loved me," she said softly. "That's the part I never told you, because it's the part that hurt most. He loved me desperately, completely, in that way young people love before the world gets hard. We were going to run away together, leave Detroit, start fresh somewhere his family wouldn't find us." Grace's throat tightened. "What happened?" His father found out about the pregnancy." "About me." Rowena's smile was sad and complicated. "He beat Tobias so badly that he was in the hospital for a week. And while Tobias was lying in that hospital bed, his father told him that if he didn't leave me, if he chose a black woman over his family, he would be disowned and destroyed. His brothers would suffer. His mother would be cast out. Everything he'd ever known would disappear. So he chose them." Grace could barely get the words out. "He chose survival," Rowena corrected gently. "He was barely out of his teenage years, baby. Terrified and hurt and raised to believe that family loyalty was the highest value. He made the choice he thought he could live with, and I have hated him and forgiven him and hated him again 1,000 times over the years." Grace stared at her mother, seeing her with new clarity. "How did you forgive him?" "I'm not sure I have," Rowena admitted with raw honesty. "But I had to stop letting his choice define my entire life. I had to stop teaching you that all men are cowards, because that's not fair, and it's not true. Some men are broken, and some men make terrible mistakes when they're scared, and some men learn too late what actually matters." Gary wasn't a scared teenager. He was a grown man with resources and power. "You're right." Rowena reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "And maybe that makes his failing worse. Or maybe it means he has more capacity to actually change, because he has resources to do the work. I can't tell you what to do, Grace. I can only tell you that you have to decide whether you want to be defined by his mistake or whether you want to define yourself by your own choices going forward." Grace stayed in Detroit through the weekend, and Rowena showed her more of Gary's letters, the ongoing correspondence he had initiated, asking questions about race and class and privilege, offering support to causes Rowena cared about without fanfare, genuinely engaging with his own ignorance in ways that felt humble rather than performative. "He's doing the work," Rowena said simply, "whether you ever see it or not, whether you ever forgive him or not. And baby, that consistency matters to me. That tells me something about his character now, even if it doesn't erase what he did before." Grace drove back to her apartment on Sunday evening, her mind churning with everything her mother had said. She thought about William and Clark and what she wanted them to learn about forgiveness and transformation. She thought about the armor she had been wearing for over 2 years and how exhausting it was to maintain that level of protection. She thought about the crack in her chest that had appeared when she saw Gary's devastated face in the garden. For the first time since leaving his office, Grace allowed herself to consider the possibility that her sons deserved to meet their father. Not because Gary deserved it, but because William and Clark deserved the chance to make their own judgments. When they were old enough to understand what it meant to have a parent who had failed and worked to do better. She called Gary's number at 3 in the morning, her heart hammering against her ribs, unable to sleep. And when he answered on the first ring as though he had been waiting beside the phone, Grace heard the hope in his voice and almost hung up. Instead, she spoke into the darkness. "One meeting, supervised, in public. You get 1 hour with them. If you bring lawyers, if you make demands, if you try to claim rights you didn't earn, I will take them somewhere you'll never find us. Do you understand?" "Yes." Gary's voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you, Grace. Thank you for—" "Don't thank me," she interrupted coldly. "This isn't for you. This is for them. Don't make me regret it." She hung up before he could respond, and she sat in her dark apartment shaking with adrenaline and fear and something that might have been the tiniest seed of hope. She hated herself for that last feeling most of all, because hope meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risking the heart Gary had already broken once. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday at the Botanical Gardens, neutral territory with open spaces and witnesses. Gary arrived an hour early, checking his phone obsessively, running his hands through his hair, looking more nervous than Grace had ever seen him. When Grace appeared with William and Clark, their small hands clasped in hers, Gary's face transformed with such raw emotion that Grace felt something twist painfully in her chest. But she had not come alone. Walking beside her was Temperance, who Grace had called to be present as an additional supervisor and witness. The message was clear. Grace did not trust Gary alone, needed multiple adults present, was taking no chances with her son's safety or emotional well-being. Gary understood immediately, and instead of being offended, he looked grateful. "Thank you for coming, Mama. Thank you for being here to make sure I do this right." Temperance studied her son carefully before nodding once. "I'm here for my grandsons, not for you. But Gary, I hope you understand what a gift you're being given." "I do," Gary promised. And then he turned his attention to William and Clark, who were watching him with the curious wariness of children meeting a stranger their mother had told them was important. Gary knelt on the pathway, bringing himself to their eye level, and his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "Hi, my name is Gary. I'm your father. I made some very serious mistakes that kept me from knowing you, and I'm trying to become someone better now, someone you might want to know someday." William studied him with solemn eyes that were so much like Gary's own that it hurt to witness. "Mama says you were scared, and you hurt her." The directness of the observation hit Gary like a physical blow, but he did not flinch from it. "That's exactly right. I was scared, and I let that fear turn me into someone cruel. I hurt your mama very badly, and I missed watching you and your brother grow. I can't change that, but I can try to do better now." Clark, less cautious than his twin, stepped closer and tilted his head to one side. "You look like us." "I do," Gary agreed, his voice thick. "We have the same eyes. They're called the Cooper curse because every generation of my family has them. But I think they're beautiful on you boys. Are you going to hurt Mama again?" William asked, and the protective concern in his small voice made both Grace and Temperance tear up. Gary looked at Grace briefly before returning his attention to his sons. "I'm going to try very hard not to hurt anyone anymore. But people sometimes make mistakes even when they're trying to be good. What matters is taking responsibility when we mess up and working to do better. That's what I'm learning." "Okay," Clark said simply, his natural friendliness overriding caution. He held out his hand for Gary to shake, a gesture he must have learned from watching adults. "Nice to meet you." Gary took the small hand in his much larger one and shook it solemnly, and something inside his chest that had been frozen for 2 years finally began to thaw. "Nice to meet you too, Clark. And you, William. Both of you." The hour passed in careful conversation, Gary following every boundary Grace established, answering the twins' questions with honesty that sometimes hurt to speak. He learned that William loved books about space and asking questions about everything, that he needed time to warm up to new situations, but once comfortable, would talk endlessly about his interests. He learned that Clark was fearless and funny and loved music and dancing, that he would hug anyone who seemed kind and collected friends everywhere he went. Grace watched from a nearby bench with Temperance beside her, and the older woman spoke quietly. "He's different. I've watched him these past months, Grace. The work he's doing is genuine. He's dismantling beliefs he didn't even know he carried. He's confronting the poison his father fed him. I'm not saying you should forgive him or trust him, but I am saying he's trying in ways I've never seen him try before. Trying doesn't erase what he did," Grace replied, her voice carefully neutral. "No, it doesn't," Temperance agreed. "But maybe watching him try teaches your son something valuable about transformation and accountability. Maybe they need to see that people can be deeply flawed and still work to become better." When the hour ended, Grace stood and called the twins back to her side, and Gary rose to his feet looking both grateful and devastated that the time had passed so quickly. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me meet them, for giving me this chance." Grace studied his face, looking for manipulation or performance, but finding only sincerity and barely contained emotion. "This wasn't for you," she reminded him. "This was for them, so they could meet you and start forming their own impressions." "I understand," Gary replied. "Grace, would you consider letting me see them again?" Grace felt her heart hammering as she stood at this crossroads, choosing which path forward would serve her sons best. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "But Gary, if you ever make them feel unwanted, if you ever make them question their worth, if you ever hurt them the way you hurt me, I will make sure you never see them again. Do you understand?" "Yes." Gary looked directly into her eyes. "I understand completely. And Grace, I would rather die than make them feel the way I made you feel." Grace herded the twins toward her car, and Temperance lingered behind, studying her son with an expression Gary could not quite read. "She's testing you," his mother said quietly. "Every interaction will be a test to see if you're genuine or performing." "Don't fail." "I won't," Gary promised. And Temperance squeezed his shoulder before following Grace and her grandsons. Gary stood alone in the botanical gardens, surrounded by flowers and sunshine and the lingering presence of his sons. And he understood that he had just been given the most precious gift of his life, a chance to begin again, to be better, to break the pattern that had poisoned his family for generations. That evening, Gary sent Grace a single photograph, himself as a young boy, sitting on his father's shoulders with a smile that looked exactly like William's. On the back, he had written in careful handwriting, "I see myself in them, and I see what I destroyed, and I won't stop working to be worthy of them." Grace stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. But the image stayed burned into her memory. As she watched her sons sleep that night, she allowed herself to wonder whether people could truly change, and whether she was brave enough to believe it. Chapter 4. The Excavation of Truth. The visits began accumulating into routine. 1 hour every Saturday at the Children's Museum, public and supervised, with Gary arriving early each week and following every boundary Grace established without complaint. He brought no expensive gifts, understanding that material things were not the path to his sons' hearts, only his presence and patience and genuine interest in their world. William remained cautious, observing Gary with careful assessment before asking questions that revealed a child's wisdom about complex adult situations. During their third visit, while building a tower from blocks, William looked up at Gary and asked, "Why didn't you want us before?" Grace tensed from her nearby bench, prepared to intervene, but Gary met his son's eyes without flinching. "I was scared. Sometimes grown-ups make terrible decisions when they're frightened. My own father taught me not to trust people, and I let that poison turn me cruel when your mama told me you were coming. I convinced myself she was lying, because believing her meant I would have to be brave." "Are you brave now?" William asked. "I'm trying to be," Gary answered honestly. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do the right thing, even when you're scared. The right thing is being here with you and trying to earn your trust." Clark, always more straightforward, asked his own questions. "Do you live with us?" "No," Gary explained gently. "I live in a different place, Sometimes parents who love their children very much don't live together because of grown-up complications. "Do you love Mama?" Clark asked with the bluntness of childhood. And Grace felt her breath catch at the directness of the question. Gary looked across the museum space to where Grace sat watching, and she saw something raw in his expression before he turned back to Clark. "Yes, I love your Mama very much. I hurt her very badly when I was scared, and she may never forgive me for that, but loving her has never stopped." Grace stood abruptly and walked toward the water fountains, needing distance from words that landed too intimately in her chest. Temperance, who had started attending visits to help supervise, followed her, and they stood in the hallway while Grace tried to compose herself. "He shouldn't say things like that in front of them," Grace said, her voice shaking. "He's confusing them, making them think we're going to be some kind of family when that's not what this is, isn't it?" Temperance asked gently. "Grace, I'm not saying you have to forgive him or want him romantically, but you are a family, you and Gary and those boys. The shape of that family is up to you, but pretending connection doesn't exist seems harder than acknowledging it and defining its boundaries." Grace wanted to argue, but Delphine's earlier words echoed in her mind about using the twins as weapons, about protecting herself versus protecting them. And she felt exhausted by the weight of decisions she was expected to make. When she returned to the museum space, William and Clark were showing Gary a dance routine they had learned in preschool, and Gary was watching them with such complete focus and delight that Grace felt something dangerous shift in her chest. That night, Grace received a text message, not words, but a photograph of William and Clark asleep in their beds, their hands clasped together as they always slept. A picture she must have taken, and then Gary must have asked for a copy of. No, wait, Gary couldn't have that photo. Grace looked closer and realized this was Gary's recreation, drawn in careful detail. Not that he must have spent hours creating, from memory of seeing them for 1 hour. The gesture was unexpected and intimate, and Grace stared at the drawing until her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. The visits continued through autumn into winter, and Gary learned the texture of his sons' lives through fragments and glimpses. He learned that William had nightmares about monsters under his bed and needed a nightlight shaped like the moon. He learned that Clark loved music and would dance to anything with a beat, making up elaborate routines that he performed with unself-conscious joy. He learned that both boys were naturally artistic, spending hours drawing elaborate scenes that they presented to Gary like treasures. Grace watched these interactions from her supervised distance, and she could feel Temperance's assessment happening beside her, could sense her mother-in-law, who wasn't quite a mother-in-law, waiting for Gary to fail or falter or reveal that his transformation was performance. But Gary remained consistent, patient when William was slow to warm up, gentle when Clark was overstimulated, honest when they asked difficult questions, and appropriately deferential to Grace's authority as their primary parent. The shift happened during their 10th visit when Clark tripped on the playground and split his forehead open. Blood streamed down his face as he screamed in terror, and Grace froze for a crucial second, her own fear paralyzing her. And in that second, Gary moved with instinctive precision. He scooped Clark into his arms, pressing his hand firmly against the wound to staunch the bleeding, speaking in calm, steady tones that cut through the boy's hysteria. "Hey, buddy, it's okay. You're okay. Head wounds bleed a lot, but they're not as bad as they look. We're going to get you fixed up. Deep breath for me. Can you do that?" Clark hiccuped through his tears, trying to breathe, and Gary carried him toward where Grace stood rooted, holding William, who had started crying for his twin. "Grace, we need to get him to urgent care. The cut needs stitches. Can you drive, or should I?" His calm certainty shook Grace out of her paralysis. "I'll drive. You keep pressure on the wound." They moved as a unit toward Grace's car, Gary climbing into the back seat with Clark, while Grace drove, and William sat in front, crying quietly. During the drive, Gary kept up a steady stream of calm commentary, distracting Clark with questions about his favorite songs and games. keeping him focused on anything except the pain and blood. At the urgent care clinic, Clark refused to let Gary leave, gripping his shirt with small fists, and the nurse asked if this was the father, and Grace heard herself say yes before she could think about the implications. Gary held Clark through the cleaning and stitching, whispering reassurances and telling silly jokes that made the boy giggle despite his fear. And when it was over and Clark had fallen asleep against Gary's chest, still gripping his shirt, Grace looked across the waiting room at the man holding her son and felt the first wall around her heart begin to crumble. They drove home in silence, heavy with what had shifted between them. And when they arrived at Grace's building, Gary carried the sleeping Clark upstairs while Grace brought William. Inside the apartment, they laid both boys in their beds. William had fallen asleep too, exhausted by the emotional upheaval, and then stood together in the doorway watching them breathe. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "for handling that so well. For staying calm when I froze." "You didn't freeze," Gary corrected gently. "You processed for a second. That's normal. Grace, you've been handling everything alone for so long. Of course, you'd have a momentary pause when confronted with medical trauma. But you got us there safely. You took care of William. You were exactly the mother they needed." Grace felt tears threatening and blinked them back. "You were good with him. Clark trusted you. That means something." "It means everything," Gary replied, his voice thick. "Grace, thank you for letting me be there, for letting me be the parent they needed in that moment." They stood in the twins' doorway, and something had shifted in the air between them, some wall lowering incrementally, some possibility emerging that neither was quite ready to name. "You should go," Grace said finally. "It's late." "I should," Gary agreed, but neither of them moved for a long moment. Finally, Gary turned toward the door, and Grace walked him out. As he stood in the hallway about to leave, he turned back. "Grace, I know I have no right to ask this, but would you consider letting me have unsupervised visits? Just a few hours on weekends. I want to take them to my apartment, show them my space, let them see that I'm building a life that has room for them." Grace felt panic, and something else warring in her chest. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "Then tell me what you need to be ready," Gary said. "What proof, what demonstration, what boundaries?" "I'll do whatever it takes." Grace studied his face in the dim hallway light. "I need to see that you'll still show up when it's not convenient, when they're sick or cranky or difficult, when it's 3 in the morning and someone has a nightmare, when it's boring and exhausting and thankless. I need to know this isn't just you performing fatherhood when it feels good." "Then let me prove it," Gary replied. "Call me the next time one of them is sick, the next time you need help at odd hours, the next time anything difficult happens. Let me show you I'll be there for the hard parts, not just the easy ones." Grace was quiet for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, but Gary, if you fail this test, there won't be another one." "I understand," he promised. "I won't fail." He left, and Grace stood in her doorway watching him disappear down the stairs, feeling terrified and hopeful in equal measure. She was opening a door she had kept sealed shut, and she had no idea what would come through it. 2 nights later, William woke with a fever, and Grace texted Gary without thinking. Muscle memory from watching him handle Clark's injury, making the action automatic. Gary arrived within 30 minutes still in pajamas, and he spent the night helping Grace with cool compresses and fever medication and comforting a miserable William while Clark slept through it all. Grace watched Gary move through her apartment in the middle of the night, competent and gentle, and something inside her chest that had been locked tight for 2 years began to thaw. Chapter 5. The Slow Thaw. The late-night call became the first of several tests. Grace didn't consciously plan, but found herself administering. When Clark had a preschool performance at an inconvenient time, she mentioned it to Gary, expecting him to make excuses. He rearranged his entire schedule and sat in a too-small chair, applauding when his son sang off-key. When William had a doctor's appointment for his asthma management, Gary asked permission to attend and took notes on the treatment plan. When Grace had a crucial museum meeting that ran late, Gary picked up the twins from school and kept them entertained for 3 hours with art projects in her apartment. Each time, Grace braced for disappointment, for the moment when Gary would reveal that his consistency had limits. Each time he showed up exactly as promised, following her instructions, respecting her authority, being present without demanding recognition. Delphine returned to Grace's life with apologies, and they sat on Grace's couch while the twins napped and had the kind of honest conversation that only deep friendship could survive. "I'm sorry I pushed too hard," Delphine said. "Your healing timeline is your own, and I had no right to judge." "You were right, though," Grace admitted. "I was holding on to anger because it felt safer than risking hope. I was using my hurt as armor, and the twins were starting to sense it." They talked for hours about forgiveness and transformation, about whether people could genuinely change or whether they just got better at performing change, about what William and Clark deserved versus what Gary deserved versus what Grace deserved. Delphine shared her own struggles with the revelation about being Gary's half-sister, about feeling betrayed by family secrets, but also feeling drawn to finally having siblings after believing herself alone. "Temperance found me because she was trying to make amends for what Winslow did to my mother," Delphine said quietly. "She spent decades searching, and when she finally found me, she didn't demand anything. She just offered truth and connection. And I realize now that's what Gary is doing with you, offering truth and connection without demanding you accept either one." Grace felt something shift in her understanding. Gary wasn't trying to force forgiveness or manipulate reconciliation. He was simply showing up consistently and letting his actions speak for themselves, allowing Grace to evaluate at her own pace, without pressure. The unsupervised visits began carefully. 2 hours every Saturday at Gary's apartment, which he had transformed into child-friendly territory with safety locks and soft corners and toys, thoughtfully chosen for developmental appropriateness. The first time Grace dropped the twins off and drove away, she nearly turned around 3 times. Panic overwhelming her at having her sons in Gary's care without supervision, but when she returned, she found William and Clark covered in flour from making cookies, laughing hysterically while Gary pretended to be shocked by the mess, and her sons ran to her with stories about their adventure that tumbled over each other in excited chaos. "Daddy taught us how to crack eggs," Clark announced, and Grace felt her heart stop at the casual use of that word, daddy, as though it had always belonged in her son's vocabulary. She looked at Gary over the twins' heads, and he gave her a small, uncertain smile that asked permission to accept the title. Grace nodded once, and she saw relief wash over his face. The visits extended 3 hours, then 4, then eventually full days, where Gary would plan activities and meals and bring the boys home tired and happy and full of stories. Grace watched their relationship deepen, watched William open up with questions about family history and identity, watched Clark drag Gary into elaborate imaginary games without self-consciousness. One evening, while picking up the twins, Grace lingered after they had run ahead to her car, and Gary asked if she wanted to come in for coffee. The invitation was casual, but weighted with unspoken implications, and Grace surprised herself by accepting. They sat in Gary's living room, so different from the cold penthouse he used to inhabit, now warm and cluttered with children's artwork and family photographs, and talked for the first time in years without the twins as buffer. Gary told her about his therapy and the painful work of recognizing his own privilege and unlearning racist conditioning. Grace shared her exhaustion with single parenting and her fear of letting her guard down. They talked about small things and large things and discovered that conversation still flowed between them when anger wasn't blocking the channels. "I miss you," Gary said suddenly, the words escaping before he could censor them. "I miss talking to you. I miss learning from you. I miss the person I was becoming when we were together before I destroyed it." Grace felt her pulse accelerate. That person you were becoming was built on a foundation that crumbled the moment you were tested. Maybe you needed to destroy it to rebuild something more stable. And have I? Gary asked. Rebuilt something more stable? Or am I still the same man pretending to be different? Grace considered the question seriously. You're different. I've watched you long enough to know the change is real. But Gary, being different doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't make us automatically compatible or mean we should be together. It just means you're becoming someone who can be trusted with our sons. I know, Gary acknowledged. I'm not asking for more than you're willing to give. I just needed you to know that the feelings never stopped, even when they should have. Grace left that evening feeling unsettled in ways she could not quite name. And when she mentioned the conversation to her mother, Rowena asked a simple question. Do you still love him? I don't know, Grace admitted. I loved who I thought he was. I hated who he actually was. And now I'm watching him become someone new, and I don't know what I feel except confused and scared and exhausted by my own guardedness. Then stop trying to figure it out, Rowena advised. Stop trying to force certainty. Just keep watching his actions and listening to your instincts and letting things unfold naturally. The answer will come when it's ready. The holidays approached, and Gary asked tentatively if he could spend them with the twins, and Grace found herself inviting him to her apartment rather than coordinating separate celebrations. They decorated a tree together while William and Clark hung ornaments at toddler height, and they cooked a meal that was chaotic and imperfect, and they opened presents in pajamas while drinking hot chocolate. It felt dangerously close to a family, and Grace felt her walls continuing to lower despite her attempts to maintain them. On New Year's Eve, after the twins had fallen asleep and Gary was preparing to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to Grace. Can I ask you something? You can ask, Grace replied carefully. If I keep doing this, if I keep showing up and being consistent and proving I've changed, is there any possibility that you might forgive me someday? Not forget, just forgive, because I need to know if I'm working towards something possible or something that will never exist, no matter how hard I try. Grace looked at him for a long moment, seeing the vulnerability in his question, the fear that he had lost her permanently. I don't know, she said honestly. I'm not ready to forgive you completely. The hurt is still too close to the surface. But Gary, I'm not actively hating you anymore, and that's progress. I'm watching you with our sons and feeling grateful instead of resentful, and that's progress too. I can't promise you forgiveness, but I can promise I'm trying not to stay frozen in the past. That's enough, Gary said quietly. That's more than enough. He left, and Grace stood at her window watching the city lights, feeling something that might have been hope beginning to bloom in her chest, despite her best efforts to suppress it. Chapter 6. The Cartography of Warfare. The fragile peace lasted exactly 3 weeks before Lysander Cooper arrived at Grace's apartment unannounced, and his presence brought the cold reality of the Cooper family's power crashing back into focus. Grace opened her door to find Gary's younger brother standing in the hallway with the particular condescension that rich white men reserve for women they considered obstacles. He was dressed in expensive tailoring that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent, and he smiled at her with the kind of superiority that made her stomach turn. "Ms. Kelly," he said, his voice smooth as poison, "I apologize for arriving without an invitation, but I think we need to have a conversation about my nephews and what's best for everyone involved." Grace did not invite him inside, did not move from blocking her doorway. "I have nothing to discuss with you. If you have something to say, you can say it to Gary." "Gary is the problem," Lysander replied, his smile never reaching his eyes. "He's become distracted, unfocused, making decisions based on emotion rather than logic. The board is concerned about his judgment. The family is concerned about his priorities. And frankly, Ms. Kelly, we're concerned about the position you've put him in." Grace felt rage ignite in her veins, the kind that came from being reduced to a problem requiring management. The position I put him in? I didn't ask him for anything. I didn't demand he be part of our lives. He chose to try to be a father after abandoning us. This is his choice. But it's affecting everyone, Lysander continued, as though she hadn't spoken, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. Which is why the family is prepared to offer you a very generous solution that benefits everyone, especially those boys. He held out the envelope and Grace did not take it, letting it hang in the air between them like an insult. I'm offering you $5 million to relocate with William and Clark to another state, somewhere far enough that Gary can focus on his responsibilities without constant distraction. It's more money than you'll see in your lifetime through legitimate means. Ms. Kelly, your sons will have excellent educations, comfortable lives, everything they need, without the complications of being entangled with our family dynamics. The casual cruelty of the offer took Grace's breath away. You think you can buy my children? You think you can pay me to disappear so your brother can stop being inconvenienced by fatherhood? I think we can compensate you fairly for the disruption this situation has caused everyone, Lysander corrected, his tone suggesting he was being entirely reasonable. $5 million is a fortune for someone in your position. Your sons will want for nothing, and honestly, Ms. Kelly, you need to consider what's best for them. Growing up as Cooper heirs means growing up in a spotlight that will destroy their innocence. It means security threats and media scrutiny, and being used as leverage by people who want to hurt this family. He leaned closer, and Grace saw calculation in his eyes. Gary has enemies, people who would hurt those boys to get to him. Is your pride worth risking their safety? Is your desire to punish my brother worth exposing them to dangers you can't even imagine? The argument was elegant and manipulative, weaponizing Grace's maternal instincts against her judgment, and she felt doubt creep into her certainty for just a moment before anger burned it away. Get out. Get away from my door before I call the police and report you for harassment. I'm trying to protect everyone, Lysander insisted, his mask of reasonableness cracking slightly. I'm trying to give you an escape from warfare you're not equipped to handle. The Cooper family eats people like you alive. Miss Kelly, I'm offering you a way out before you get destroyed. Before Grace could respond, Gary's voice cut through the hallway from behind Lysander, and Grace looked up to see him standing by the elevator with an expression of fury she had never witnessed on his face. Get away from her. Get away from her and my sons, or I will make you regret every decision that brought you here. Lysander turned slowly, his composure cracking further. Gary, be reasonable. I'm trying to protect you. Protect me! Gary moved closer, and Grace saw violence barely contained in his movements. You came to the mother of my children with money and threats, trying to make her disappear the way Dad made Josephine disappear. And you think that's protection? Don't bring Josephine into this, Lysander snapped, his own anger finally showing. That was different. That was exactly the same, Gary interrupted, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. The same family playbook where we pay problems to disappear, where we value reputation over relationships, where we treat people like commodities to be managed. And I'm done with it, Lysander. I'm done enabling this family's cruelty. The confrontation escalated quickly, decades of sibling resentment exploding into the open. Lysander accused Gary of abandoning his responsibilities and prioritizing personal drama over family legacy. Gary responded with accusations about Lysander's greed and complicity in their father's worst behaviors. Their voices rose while Grace stood in her doorway, and then William and Clark emerged from their bedroom frightened by the shouting. Grace immediately pulled her sons close, sheltering them from adult conflict, and she saw Gary's face transform when he realized the twins were witnessing this ugliness. He moderated his voice instantly, stepping back from his brother, creating space and calm. Enough, Grace said, her voice cutting through the tension with absolute authority. Both of you need to leave now. My sons don't need to witness this. And I don't need either of you making decisions about their lives in my hallway. Lysander turned to her with something like triumph in his eyes. See, she understands. She knows that being part of our family means being part of warfare, and she's smart enough to choose peace for her children. I'm not choosing anything except the door, Grace corrected icily, because you both seem to have forgotten that these boys have a mother who gets to make decisions about their well-being. And right now, I'm deciding that neither of you deserves to be in their presence. Gary's face crumpled with understanding of what he had done, bringing his family's toxicity to her doorstep, allowing Cooper dysfunction to invade the safe space she had built. Grace, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was coming here. I would have stopped him. Would have stopped him how? Grace interrupted, her voice shaking. How do you stop your family from seeing my sons as obstacles? How do you promise me that being in your world won't destroy them? Because, Gary, your brother just offered me $5 million to disappear, and that's not normal. That's not safe. That's the kind of family you want to bring my children into. Lysander seized the moment. Exactly my point. Take the money, Ms. Kelly. Give your sons a life without this chaos. They deserve better than being pawns in family warfare. Grace looked at Lysander with such contempt that he actually stepped backward. You don't get to tell me what my sons deserve. You don't get to weaponize my love for them against my judgment. And you definitely don't get to pretend that paying me to disappear is about their well-being rather than your inheritance. She turned to Gary, and he saw something in her expression that looked like disappointment, like the walls she had been slowly lowering were being reconstructed in real time. I need both of you to leave. And Gary, don't come to the visit this Saturday. Don't call me. Don't contact me until I decide whether exposing my sons to your family is worth the risk. Grace, please. Gary reached for her and she stepped back sharply, maintaining distance. I said leave. Her voice was final, absolute, and Gary felt something inside him shatter as he realized he had just lost ground. He had spent months gaining through one moment of family dysfunction he could not control. Lysander left, with promises that sounded like threats about family lawyers and custody arrangements. And Gary lingered in the hallway, desperate to fix what his brother had broken. But Grace closed her door without another word. He heard the locks engaging one by one, sealing him out. And he stood in the empty hallway, understanding that his family was a poison that would keep infecting everything he tried to build unless he took drastic action. He pulled out his phone and made a call that would change everything. I need to schedule an emergency board meeting, and I need our legal team prepared for nuclear options. It's time to cut out the rot in the Cooper family, starting with my father. I'm removing Winslow from the board, and anyone who opposes it can join him in exile. That night, Grace held her sons while they asked questions about the angry men in the hallway, and she tried to explain, without terrifying them, that sometimes families disagreed about important things, that not everyone made good choices about how to handle conflict. Is our daddy bad? William asked, his small face worried. No, baby, Grace said, pulling him close. Your daddy is trying very hard to be good. But sometimes being good isn't enough when the people around you are making bad choices. Sometimes the problem is bigger than one person can fix alone. Clark curled into her other side, and Grace felt the weight of her responsibility crushing down. She needed to protect her sons from the Cooper family's warfare, but she also needed to give Gary a fair chance to prove he was different from his relatives. The balance felt impossible. Her phone buzzed with a message from Gary, and despite her anger, she opened it. I'm removing my father from the company board. I'm establishing legal protections for William and Clark that shield them from family politics. I'm making it clear to every Cooper that my sons are untouchable. I will burn down everything I built before I let my family hurt them. You have my word, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it's worth something. Grace stared at the message and felt something crack in her chest that had been carefully held together. She did not respond, but she saved the message, and as she watched her sons fall asleep, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that Gary was willing to sacrifice everything to be their father. The question was whether sacrifice was enough. or whether some damage could never be fully repaired. Chapter 7. The Crucible of Fire. The emergency board meeting happened within 48 hours, and Gary Cooper walked into that room with the certainty of a man who had finally chosen which version of himself he wanted to be. Winslow sat at the head of the table, flanked by Lysander and board members who had spent decades enabling Cooper family dysfunction. And Gary saw his father's empire laid out before him like a kingdom he was about to dismantle. "This meeting is about the future of Cooper Enterprises," Gary began, his voice steady despite adrenaline flooding his system. "Specifically, it's about whether we continue operating with the same corruption that has defined this family for generations, or whether we finally take accountability." Winslow's face hardened into the expression Gary had learned to fear as a child, but fear no longer controlled him the way it once had. "Gary, whatever personal issues you're experiencing need to remain personal. This company was built on exploitation and maintained through intimidation," Gary interrupted, his voice cutting through his father's authority like a blade. "And I'm done pretending that profit justifies cruelty. I'm done enabling your racism. I'm done watching you poison everything you touch." He placed a folder on the table, sliding it toward the board members with deliberate precision. "This contains documentation of attempts to bribe and threaten the mother of my children. It contains evidence of discriminatory hiring practices. It contains proof that this family has spent decades destroying people who inconvenienced us rather than taking accountability." Lysander stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You're out of line. You're letting personal drama cloud your judgment." "Personal drama?" Gary's laugh was sharp and bitter. "My sons are not drama, Lysander. They're human beings who deserve protection from a family that would rather pay their mother to disappear than acknowledge them. And if that's controversial to you, if treating children with basic decency is somehow radical, then everyone in this room needs to understand exactly what kind of people we've become." The meeting devolved into chaos, board members arguing while Gary stood his ground with calm that surprised even himself. He had prepared by securing voting proxies from shareholders, tired of Cooper family scandals, by building alliances with board members who valued ethics over tradition, by ensuring that even if he lost this battle, he could wage a war that would expose everything his family had hidden. Winslow tried every tactic he had perfected: intimidation, manipulation, appeals to family loyalty. But Gary had been inoculated against these strategies through therapy and genuine commitment to change. When his father finally played his last card, threatening complete disown Gary if he continued this rebellion, Gary felt nothing but relief. "Then disinherit me," Gary said quietly. "I don't want your money if it comes with betraying my sons. I don't want your approval if it requires abandoning my integrity. And I definitely don't want to be the kind of man you raised me to become." He addressed the full board directly. "I'm proposing that Winslow Cooper be removed from this board immediately. I'm proposing oversight measures to prevent discrimination that has characterized our leadership. And I'm proposing we establish a foundation supporting families that Cooper family members have harmed over the years." Before Winslow could respond, Temperance walked into the meeting, and her presence was confirmation enough. "Everything my son just said is true," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was doing. "I've remained silent while Winslow poisoned our family with his cruelty. I enabled his behavior by staying married to him, by pretending that loyalty meant tolerating abuse. But I will not watch him destroy another generation. I will not watch him turn my grandsons into casualties of his racism." She moved to stand beside Gary, literally choosing her son over her husband. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'm using my shares to vote for Winslow's removal. My son is trying to break a cycle that has destroyed too many lives." The board meeting concluded with Winslow's removal by a narrow margin, and Gary understood this victory was fragile. that his father would retaliate in ways both legal and personal. But watching Winslow leave the building diminished and furious, Gary felt something like freedom settling into his bones. Temperance waited for Gary in the parking garage, and when he reached her, she pulled him into an embrace. "Your father will come after you with everything he has. He will try to destroy you financially, socially, professionally. Are you prepared?" "I'm prepared to protect my sons," Gary replied. "Everything else is negotiable." He drove to Grace's apartment without calling first, needing her to hear directly what had happened, needing her to understand that he had chosen William and Clark over everything else. But when Grace opened her door, her expression was wary rather than welcoming. "I removed my father from the company," Gary said without preamble. "I exposed his attempts to bribe you. I made it clear that anyone who threatens you or the boys will answer to me. I'm taking action, Grace, not just making promises." Grace listened without speaking, and when he finished, she asked one simple question that cut through every justification. "Is this actually about protecting them, or is this about proving something to me?" And the question landed like a punch. "Both," Gary admitted. "I want to protect them because they're my sons and I love them. But I also need you to see that I'm willing to sacrifice everything to be their father." "Actions matter," Grace agreed. "But Gary, you've known your sons for months. You've had supervised visits and pleasant afternoons. You haven't been there for the exhaustion of single parenting. You're fighting your family for the idea of fatherhood, but I need to know if you're prepared for the reality." The observation was valid and devastating. Gary had been part of his sons' lives in the easiest possible way, showing up for fun, then leaving before things got difficult. "You're right. Let me prove it. Let me be there for the hard parts." "My mother wants to meet you," Grace said finally. "She's visiting this weekend. If you're serious about being part of the boys' lives, you need to face the woman whose daughter you destroyed and explain why you deserve a second chance." Gary felt his stomach drop because he understood what this meant. Rowena was the guardian of Grace's heart, and her approval or rejection would influence Grace's decision more than anything Gary could say. "I'll be there. I'll answer any question she has." "Don't prove it to her," Grace corrected sharply. "Prove it to yourself through actions every day." Gary left understanding that removing his father from the board was just the beginning of a much longer war. But as he drove home, he felt something that might have been hope, because Grace had given him another chance when she had every reason not to. That evening, Grace called Delphine for the first time since their fight, and their reconciliation was messy and incomplete, but genuine. When Delphine agreed to come to Rowena's visit to meet her biological brother properly, Grace felt some weight lifting. The weekend arrived with autumn rain, and Gary stood on Grace's doorstep preparing to face judgment from the woman whose daughter he had failed, knowing this conversation would determine everything. Chapter 8. The Resurrection of Possibility. Rowena Kelly stood in Grace's living room, and Gary Cooper felt maternal assessment settling over him like gravity. She was smaller than he expected, her body worn from decades of cleaning houses, but her eyes held the particular strength of women who had survived everything and emerged with dignity intact. Beside her stood Delphine, his half-sister, meeting him properly for the first time. "Mr. Cooper," Rowena said, her voice neutral, "my daughter tells me you want to be part of my grandson's lives. I'm here to understand why I should support that." Gary had prepared for this conversation, but standing in front of Rowena, all preparation dissolved into honesty. "I don't deserve your support, Mrs. Kelly. I don't deserve your daughter's forgiveness or your grandson's trust. I treated Grace like she was disposable, and I can't undo that. But I can commit to being better every day, and I can promise that William and Clark will never doubt they're wanted." "Promises are cheap," Rowena replied. "Grace's father made promises too. Then he abandoned me when his family threatened him, and I raised my daughter alone while he built a respectable life. You understand why I don't trust white men's promises?" Gary absorbed the comparison without deflecting. Yes, ma'am, and I understand that my words mean nothing compared to my actions. So I'm not asking you to trust promises. I'm asking you to watch what I do and judge me based on that. Delphine moved closer, studying Gary. They had the same eyes, the same facial structure. Do you know what it's like to discover I have a brother? To find out my entire life was shaped by a man who abandoned my mother the way you abandoned Grace. To realize the family I've been helping raise shares my blood. I can't imagine, Gary said honestly. I'm sorry, Delphine. I'm sorry our father did to your mother what he taught me to do to Grace. I'm sorry that our family's abandonment pattern has hurt you. At least you're trying, Delphine replied, grudging respect in her voice. That's more than Winslow ever did for my mother. The afternoon proceeded with Rowena asking questions designed to expose inconsistency about his therapy, his understanding of racism, his plans for supporting Grace without wielding money as power. She asked about his relationship with Temperance and whether she would be safe divorcing Winslow. She asked what Gary would tell his sons when they were old enough to understand the full story. I'll tell them the truth, Gary said. That I was scared and cowardly when your daughter needed me to be brave. That I let my father's poison become my own. That I almost destroyed the best thing that ever happened to me because I valued safety over love. And I'll tell them their mother is the strongest person I've ever known. Rowena's expression softened slightly, and Grace, who had been quiet throughout, looked at Gary with something in her eyes he could not quite name. William and Clark emerged from their room during a pause, and Gary watched his sons meet their grandmother for the first time. Rowena's face transformed when she saw the twins, all protective severity melting into pure love. She knelt to embrace them. Look at you beautiful boys. You'd look just like your daddy, but I see your mama in your smile. William studied her seriously. Are you mama's mama? I am, baby. And that makes me your grandma Rowena. Clark threw his arms around her neck. We have lots of family now. We have Mama and Daddy and Grandma Temperance and Grandma Rowena and Aunt Delphine. The casual way Clark included Gary in their family structure made Gary's throat tighten, and he looked at Grace to see tears streaming silently down her face. The moment was enormous and ordinary simultaneously. The visit extended into dinner, and Gary stayed at Grace's request, helping cook, while Rowena told stories about Grace's childhood, and Delphine shared memories of Josephine. The conversation was bittersweet, full of laughter and grief mixing together. As evening wound down, Rowena pulled Gary aside. I see you trying. I see genuine effort and genuine change. But Mr. Cooper, trying isn't enough if you stop when things get hard. Don't be another man who gives up. I won't, Gary promised. Grace walked Gary to the door after her mother and Delphine left. They stood in the doorway with charged silence. Thank you for today, for facing my mother's questions, for being honest about your failures. Thank you for letting me be here, for giving me chances I don't deserve. They looked at each other, and Gary felt the pull between them, the complicated tangle of history and hurt and something that might have been healing. He wanted to reach for her, but understood that rushing would destroy everything he had been building. He simply said goodnight and left, and Grace watched him walk away, feeling something crack open in her chest that had been frozen since he broke her heart. Over following weeks, Gary began showing up for unglamorous parenting, picking up twins from preschool, staying through stomach bugs, attending parent-teacher conferences and doctor's appointments. He learned that fatherhood was not grand gestures but accumulated small moments, that love was demonstrated through showing up consistently. Grace watched this transformation with careful attention, noting when Gary handled difficult situations with patience, observing how he spoke to their sons about emotions and boundaries. She saw him learning in real time. The shift happened one evening when Clark woke screaming from a nightmare, and Gary was there within 20 minutes, gathering his son into his arms until the boy calmed. Grace watched from the doorway, and when Gary looked up and met her eyes over Clark's head, something passed between them that felt dangerously like trust. "Stay," Grace heard herself say. "It's late. Just sleep on the couch." Gary looked at her with surprise and hope, and he nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was offering. In the morning, Grace woke to find him making breakfast with William, while Clark still slept. The domestic seemed so natural it hurt. They ate together as a family, and when Gary prepared to leave, William asked when he would come back. Gary looked at Grace for permission. "Whenever your mama says I can. How about dinner tomorrow?" Grace found herself saying. The invitations accumulated into routine, Gary becoming a steady presence rather than a supervised visitor. He kept his own apartment, but spent increasing time at Grace's place. One evening, Gary's hand brushed Grace's while washing dishes, and instead of pulling away, Grace let her hand rest against his. The contact was electric and terrifying. "I still love you," Gary said quietly. "I never stopped. And I understand if you can never love me back, if the damage is permanent. But I needed you to know." Grace turned off the water and dried her hands slowly. "I don't know if I can love you the way I did before. That girl doesn't exist anymore. You broke her. But I think maybe I could love you differently, if you keep being the man you're becoming, rather than the man you were." Gary turned to face her fully, tears in his eyes. "I will spend every day being worthy of that possibility." They stood in Grace's small kitchen, surrounded by domestic chaos, and Grace let herself imagine trying again, risking her heart on the man who had destroyed it, choosing hope over protection. She did not kiss him yet, but she took his hand properly, threading her fingers through his, and the gesture felt like a promise. Chapter 9: The Reckoning of Futures. Winslow Cooper's retaliation came swift and vicious. Lawsuits challenging Gary's authority, leaked stories to media about Cooper family dysfunction, photographers outside Grace's building. Grace woke to headlines speculating about baby mama drama, tearing apart one of the city's most prominent families. Racist commentary painting her as a gold digger who had trapped Gary. Gary hired security that Grace initially resisted, but after a photographer followed the twins to preschool, she accepted protection with mixed resentment and gratitude. The security felt like both care and reminder of danger inherent in loving someone from Gary's world. The situation escalated when Winslow's lawyers filed for grandparents' rights, claiming William and Clark deserved a relationship with their grandfather, regardless of conflict between Gary and his father. The legal filing was manipulative, painting Winslow as a concerned grandparent, denied access by an unstable mother and a son influenced against family. Grace read the documents with growing horror, every carefully crafted sentence designed to make her look unfit. The filing referenced her modest income, her lack of traditional family support, the fact that she was raising biracial children without adequate preparation for racism they would face. "He's trying to take them from me," Grace told Gary, her voice shaking. "Your father is actually trying to claim custody rights." "He won't succeed," Gary promised, but she saw worry he could not hide. "We have documentation of his racism, his manipulation." "We have nothing," Grace interrupted. "We have money fighting money, and I'm a black woman going against one of the most powerful white men in the city. Do you understand the optics?" The conversation spiraled into their first real fight since Gary had started rebuilding, and Grace found herself confronting that loving Gary meant perpetual warfare. "I can't do this. I can't raise my sons in constant legal battles and media attention. Maybe your brother was right. Maybe the smart thing is to take money and disappear." "You don't mean that," Gary's voice cracked. "William and Clark need both their parents. What they need is to grow up without being pawns in your family's warfare," Grace interrupted. "And maybe that means protecting them from all of it, including you." The words destroyed Gary visibly, and before he could respond, William and Clark emerged frightened by their mother's distress. Grace pulled them close, and William asked with heartbreaking perception, "Is Daddy leaving again?" The question shattered them both. Gary knelt to his son's level. No, buddy. I'm not leaving, I promise. Mama and I are having a disagreement, but I'm not going anywhere. After the twins returned to their room, Grace collapsed on her couch, crying with exhaustion and fear. Gary sat beside her, not touching but present, and when she looked up, he was crying too. I can't lose them again, Gary whispered. I will do anything, but I can't lose them. How do you stop a man with infinite resources and no moral boundaries? Grace asked. I remove the resources, Gary replied, his voice taking on hardness. I expose every corrupt practice. I destroy him completely. The plan was risky. Exposing Winslow meant exposing entire Cooper family dysfunction, meant Gary would burn down his legacy. But as he outlined his strategy, working with journalists and investigators, documenting Winslow's crimes, Grace understood he was choosing his sons over everything. If you do this, there's no going back, Grace warned. Your family will hate you. You'll lose everything your father built. Good, Gary said simply. Everything he built was constructed on cruelty. I want to build something new with you and our sons, something based on integrity. Gary executed his plan with systematic precision, exposing documents showing Winslow's discrimination, financial crimes, personal corruption. He gave interviews detailing his father's cruelty. He established a victim compensation fund and invited people Winslow had destroyed to come forward. The media explosion was spectacular. The Cooper name became synonymous with scandal. But the grandparents' rights case collapsed when Winslow's documented racism became public record. Grace watched Gary navigate devastation with grace, accepting loss after loss, while maintaining focus on protecting their family. His relationships fractured, friends vanished, but he showed up every day for William and Clark with consistency that proved his commitment. One evening, Grace found Gary sitting on her building's steps looking defeated. His penthouse was surrounded by reporters. His family had disowned him. He had nowhere else to go. She stood behind him, debating, before making a decision that terrified and thrilled her. Come inside. Stop going home to an empty apartment. Stay here. Be with your family. Gary turned, shock and hope in his expression. Grace, are you sure? I'm choosing, Grace interrupted. I'm choosing to believe you've changed. I'm choosing to trust that you'll keep choosing us. I'm choosing to try building something new. She pulled him inside, not to her bedroom yet, but to the home she had built with their sons. I can't promise this will be easy. I can't promise I won't struggle with trusting you. I'm not asking for promises, Gary replied. I'm asking for the chance to keep proving myself every day. Grace looked at him for a long moment before speaking words that changed everything. I'm not ready to forgive you completely, but I'm ready to try. I'm ready to see if we can build something real from the wreckage. Gary pulled her close. Finally, after months of careful distance, and Grace let herself be held, feeling the possibility that some broken things could be remade stronger. William and Clark found them the next morning wrapped together on the couch, and the twins climbed on top with delighted giggles, announcing they were a family pile, and Grace felt something that might have been joy blooming in her chest. Chapter 10. The Architecture of Beginning. The healing happened slowly over the following year, in accumulated moments of trust rebuilt and promises kept. Gary moved into Grace's apartment fully, his expensive life downsized to fit their smaller, warmer space. William and Clark thrived with both parents present, their personalities expanding as they felt secure. Delphine became a fixture in their lives, embracing her role as aunt and half-sister. Temperance completed her divorce and moved near Grace's building, becoming the grandmother the twins deserved. She and Rowena developed an unlikely friendship built on shared understanding. The legal warfare with Winslow exhausted itself, the old man diminished by scandal. Gary maintained strict boundaries, protecting his family from desperate manipulation attempts. There was grief in watching his father become pathetic, but Gary accepted that grief as part of breaking free. Grace and Gary began couples therapy, working through trust issues and racial dynamics and whether genuine change was permanent. Their therapist pushed them both. Grace to examine whether she was still punishing Gary, Gary to confront subtle ways he still expected privilege. The work was uncomfortable and essential. Grace returned to school part-time, while Gary handled childcare and household labor. Watching him wash dishes and fold laundry without expecting praise taught Grace more about transformation than any grand gesture. They celebrated the twins' 5th birthday with chosen family gathered, and Gary looked around understanding that this was wealth, not money, but people who loved them. Children who felt secure, a partner who had chosen to try again. That evening, Gary asked Grace to walk with him. They walked to the botanical gardens where everything had begun. "I've been carrying something for months," Gary said, pulling out a small box. "Waiting to be worthy?" The ring inside was simple and beautiful, chosen with thought about her taste. "I'm not asking because I deserve you. I'm asking because I want to spend my life earning you." He pulled out a document, a detailed plan for partnership. "This is a blueprint. It's not romantic, but it's real." Grace held both, thinking about the girl who had walked out of his office pregnant and heartbroken, and the woman she had become. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I've completely forgiven the past. Not because I think we'll never hurt each other, but because I believe you when you say you'll keep trying." Gary slid the ring onto her finger and kissed her. Really kissed her for the first time in years. And Grace felt everything. The love and hurt and hope tangled together. They married 6 months later in a small ceremony, reflecting their values. When the officiant asked for vows, they spoke honestly about work they had done and would continue doing. "I vow to keep confronting my privilege and learning from your experience," Gary said. "I vow to listen when you tell me I'm wrong. I vow to share power. I vow to keep risking trust even when it's scary," Grace replied. "I vow to tell you when I'm hurt rather than building walls. I vow to believe in your capacity for change." Rowena and Temperance stood together as mothers of the couple, symbolic of families created by choice. The celebration was full of joy and music and happiness that comes from surviving hardship together. That night, Grace and Gary held each other in darkness. "I love you," Grace whispered. "Not the way I loved you before. That love was naive. This love is harder and stronger and built on reality." Gary pressed his face into her hair. "I will spend every day earning that love." The years that followed brought ordinary challenges, disagreements about money and parenting, whose turn for tantrums, but they navigated with tools built through therapy and commitment. When Gary slipped into old patterns, Grace called him on it. When Grace withdrew behind walls, Gary gently coaxed her back. William and Clark grew into remarkable boys who understood complexity early, who knew their family's history and carried it as both burden and gift. They asked hard questions about race and privilege and their grandfather they would never meet, and their parents answered honestly. On the twins' 8th birthday, Grace stood in their apartment watching Gary play with their sons, William teaching about constellations, Clark performing an elaborate dance. The scene was perfectly ordinary, and Grace felt her throat tighten. Delphine came beside her, pregnant with her first child. "You did it. You broke the pattern." "We all did it," Grace corrected. "You and me and Gary and Temperance and Rowena. We decided inheritance could be transformed." That evening, Grace found the letter Gary had written years ago and read his words about becoming worthy. She saw how he had kept that promise through thousands of small choices. She wrote him a letter in return, telling him that forgiveness was practice, that she chose him new every morning, that their love story was about two imperfect people committed to growing together. She left it on his pillow, and when he found it the next morning, she watched him cry while reading. Grace Kelly Cooper stood at her window watching the city, the same city where she had once walked away from Gary's tower with her heart shattered. She thought about that girl, the one who had been brave enough to survive until this moment, and she sent gratitude backward through time, because survival had transformed into something she had never dared imagine, a love rebuilt from ashes. complicated and imperfect and absolutely real. A family constructed from choice and commitment. A future where her sons would grow up knowing people could change, mistakes could be repaired. The greatest act of strength was not protection, but vulnerability. She turned from the window and climbed into bed beside her husband, and Gary's arms settled around her waist. Outside, the city continued, but inside their home, everything was still and safe and exactly as it should be. Grace closed her eyes and felt peace settle over her. The gift of second chances, the miracle of transformation, the revolutionary act of believing that broken things could be remade stronger. And in the morning, she would wake beside the man who had destroyed and rebuilt her, and she would choose him again, because that was what love looked like when it was real, not the absence of failure, but the presence of repair, offered daily, earned constantly, and given freely by two people brave enough to believe that becoming better was always possible.